can listen to The Front on your smart speaker every morning. To hear the latest episode, just say, "Play the news from The Australian."
From The Australian, here's what's on the front. I'm Claire Harvey. It's Thursday, June 13. The Greens and pro-climate Senate crossbenchers are vowing to block any attempt by a future coalition government to weaken Australia's emissions reduction targets. That's after Peter Dutton said he'd slow down Australia's energy transition in the short term. Police involved in the flawed initial investigation into the disappearance of mother of two Bronwyn Winfield put surveillance on a clairvoyant, but not on her estranged husband. A local fortune teller and tarot card reader was the only person regarded with suspicion by investigators immediately after Bronwyn vanished in 1993. That's the new revelation in episode 5 of our podcast, Bronwyn, available now at bronwynpodcast.com. Immigration Minister Andrew Giles has fought all the way to the federal court to prevent a Chinese-born young woman becoming an Australian citizen. Today, why the minister at the centre of a scandal about allowing criminals to stay in Australia says this young woman is not entitled to citizenship. Ngie Su was born in China in 2001, the daughter of a 15-year-old mother. After a long and difficult labour ending in an emergency caesarean, the baby was abandoned by her mum. Ngie was born with significant brain hemorrhaging, and she was diagnosed as having suffered brain damage because of a lack of oxygen during delivery. She had 3 lumps on her head and was suffering seizures shortly after birth. An Australian woman happened to be working in the village and heard about the baby's situation. Alexandra Jagelman was working as medical director of a local charity, running a clinic for pregnant women and children. She had met the baby's mother a few months earlier, conducting a prenatal check about halfway through her pregnancy. Here's how Alexandra Jagelman described what happened next. We've used a voice actor to bring you her words from a statement to court.
The doctors at the hospital told the birth parents that the baby would not be normal and would never speak. My colleague was contacted and was asked by the birth family if I, as the medical director for the NGO, whom they'd met at the village clinic, could confirm that the baby had problems so that they could decapitate it.
The baby's community are Lahu, a hill tribe living mainly in Yunnan province in China's southeast, close to the border with Thailand. They practice a faith called animism, a belief that spirituality is in all of nature, that plants and animals have souls. One of their beliefs, according to Jagelman, was that children with disabilities were cursed. Jagelman was standing in a street with her 3 children, walking home from work, when her colleague told her the birth family had asked if she could assess the baby.
I immediately agreed to help. However, I told him it can be very difficult to know the extent of brain damage in a newborn, and if I do find there are any signs of brain damage, I would not allow them to kill the baby. I would take the baby, no matter the problem. Upon hearing the threat to the baby's life, I immediately decided I would raise her as my own daughter, no matter the disabilities, in order to save her life.
She arrived at the hospital and saw the baby's desperate situation. She was having constant seizures and had not been fed since birth.
I spoke with the birth parents and confirmed what the paediatrician had said, that it was very likely that the baby had some brain damage, although it was impossible to say what the extent would be. The birth parents immediately turned around and walked out of the hospital. The paediatrician asked if I would take responsibility for the baby. I said yes, I'll raise the baby and be her mother. I told her I'd pay for all the medical expenses, including the emergency caesarean section for the birth mother and all medical expenses. I then asked for a bottle of milk formula and proceeded to sit on the hospital bed and successfully fed her, despite her abnormal reflexes. I gave her the name Hope.
True to her word, Alexandra Jagelman became the baby's mother, giving the child her first bottle. baby Ngie had a remarkable recovery.
To say things looked bleak early in Ngie's life is certainly an understatement.
Paul Garvey is the Australian's West Australia Bureau Chief.
So after that start, here we are more than 20 years later, and Ngie, who also goes by the name of Hope, is a thriving, vibrant young woman. No lingering ill effects from those horrific brain injuries sustained during her birth. In many different senses, a miraculous story here. She's alive and well. The only issue is her citizenship.
He's spent months recently deeply reporting some of the curliest cases that come before Australia's courts and tribunals relating to immigration, visas and citizenship.
It's quite startling. So I have been living and breathing various court decisions in this immigration space now for the past few weeks. I've literally been reading these decisions in my sleep. I have dreams where I'm reading more Direction 99 decisions. And then to come across this federal court decision, finding that this girl born in these incredibly difficult circumstances, taken in, supported and raised by this, for all intents and purposes, this wonderful woman who's dedicated her life to helping these disadvantaged people, to see that then challenged by the government, by the Immigration Minister, to have her citizenship opposed in this sort of way really is quite jarring when you see the extents that have been taken from a legislative perspective to make it less likely for convicted criminals to be deported through Direction 99, to then see the same minister who introduced those easier set of conditions for those convicted criminals to then turn around and challenge and fight the citizenship for this young woman who has been raised in this Australian family her entire life. It's quite disturbing to see.
In 2023, the federal government declined Ngie Su's application for citizenship.
So this falls to a question of law around when someone is entitled to claim Australian citizenship by descent. So under the law, if your parent at the time of your birth is an Australian citizen, then you basically will receive Australian citizenship. This case is a lot more complicated than that, though, because at the very moment when this child came out of the womb and was born, her biological parents, this 15-year-old girl and her partner, they were not Australian citizens. Now, Alexandra Jagelman, she was certainly an Australian, but at that precise moment when this child was born, she was not that child's mother. So what the lawyers have been fighting over in the Administrative Appeals Tribunal and then the federal court is at what point those definitions of a child being born actually take effect. If it is that simple moment of leaving the womb, or if it's something more complex and nuanced, which is what the AAT found, that the moment that this child was known to have a brain injury was effectively the point at which Miss Jagelman became her mother. So that's the legal point that this case hinges on.
She went to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal and argued Alexandra Jagelman was her mother, that because she'd been involved in the pregnancy and had given the baby her first food, she was the equivalent of a biological parent. And the Administrative Appeals Tribunal agreed.
The federal court came in with a much stricter interpretation on that, overturned the AAT decision and found that at the point of birth, this child's parents were indeed the biological parents who were not Australian citizens.
Yep. The Minister, Andrew Giles, appealed the tribunal's decision to the Federal Court of Australia. Here's what the Minister's lawyers argued on behalf of the Commonwealth. They're being read by a voice actor.
The tribunal ought to have construed the phrase, "at the time of the birth," as meaning the precise moment in time on the particular day that a child is born. And the facts, as found by the tribunal, fell necessarily outside the description of "at the time of Ms. Su's birth."
Ngie's lawyers said "at the time of birth." That phrase could apply to the first few days of a baby's life. In a judgment handed down on June 5, the justices threw out the AAT's ruling and held up the decision made by Giles to refuse Ngie's citizenship. In their judgment, they wrote,
"The time of birth of a child is not a period of indefinite duration. In its ordinary meaning, the phrase denotes the point in time from which a baby exists or starts life outside of his or her birth mother's body.
They said the phrase "at the time of birth" wasn't applied correctly by the AAT, and therefore its finding couldn't stand.
Although Ms. Jagelman has undertaken a prenatal check of Ms. Su's biological mother when she was 5 months pregnant, Ms. Jagelman did not, at the time of that check, or any time prior to being informed of Ms. Su's birth, acknowledge, represent, or assume any parental responsibilities for Ms. Su.
They also offered a heartfelt acknowledgement of Jagelman's gesture.
The application of that narrow time requirement to the facts of the present case is heartbreaking. Ms. Jagelman's dedication and devotion to her daughter is unquestionable. However, the pathways to Australian citizenship chosen by Parliament are circumscribed by arbitrary lines. The fairness of those lines reflect the legislative policy choices made by Parliament.
Coming up, why Ngie's older brothers, born in remarkably similar circumstances, got a very different result. Paul Garvey's reporting on this issue has been truly breathtaking. He's been combing through dense judgments and talking to everyone about the complex nature of Australia's immigration decisions. Our subscribers have been with him every step of the way, and you can join us at theaustralian.com.au. We'll be back after this break. Before Ngie's birth, Jagelman had brought into her family 2 other young people born with medical conditions.
So the first of these boys, a boy named Ngie, he was born in a hospital in 1998. He too was abandoned by his biological parents at birth. He was born with a cleft lip and a cleft palate, and the Aka ethnic minority parents again saw those conditions as a sign that the child was cursed. Miss Jagelman was working in the hospital at the time. She observed that this baby was just being left and neglected in the hospital, wasn't being fed. And after 3 days, she went to the director of the hospital and offered to raise the boy as her own child. So she's been raising Ngie ever since. Now, 18 months later, she gets a call from a paediatrician at the hospital telling her that another newborn baby has just been abandoned by his biological parents, again because of a cleft lip and cleft palate, and asking her if she could take that baby. She gets to the hospital the next day and is surprised to find that the biological parents are there in the hospital with this child. Miss Jagelman says to them, "Look, I'm not going to take your baby." She shows how to feed this baby with a special cleft palate bottle, and promises that when the baby is 5 months old, she will organise the free surgery to correct the cleft palate. She gets home the following day, and the shopkeeper next door gives her a box which has been left for her. She opens the box, and inside is the baby, the bottle, his birth certificate, and a note asking her to raise this child. She subsequently found out that the parents had confided to the hospital that if they took the baby home, their relatives would see the baby as cursed and would have killed the baby. Both these boys, similar stories to that of Ngie. Those 2 boys had their cases go before the Administrative Appeals Tribunal in 2020 and 2021 respectively. Both made similar arguments to what we saw with Ngie last year. Both received favourable outcomes from the tribunal, and neither boy had their outcome challenged by the Immigration Minister of the time. This is different in that we've had a similar decision, similar circumstances, yet Andrew Giles, as the Minister, has used his authority to fight this decision and take it to the federal court, which has sided with him and his department in this case.
Since Ngie's older brothers were granted citizenship, the full court of the federal court made a new decision clarifying how the question of time of birth should be interpreted. And that's what led the court to its decision in Ngie's case. The Minister gave the Australian a statement on Wednesday evening saying simply Ngie's case was about time of birth, and that's what guided the court's decision. Paul Garvey is the Australian's West Australia Bureau Chief. Chris Dawson finds out on Thursday if his appeal against his murder conviction has been successful. Come back to the front to find out what happens to the teacher's pet case after yet another twist.